Hello, hello. Welcome back to No Me Callo. I won't stay quiet. I'm your host, Jessica Lomelin, and there's a conversation that I don't think we're having enough. Who convinced us that we have to be the same person forever? At what point did growing up become a promise of permanence? And who decided that changing your mind was betrayal? Because if I'm honest, there is a question that has been following me for a long time. One of those questions that appears when you're driving alone in silence, when you're cleaning up your house on a Sunday afternoon, when you see an old photo on your phone and for a moment you miss someone who doesn't even exist anymore. The question is this: who taught me that I had to be the same person forever? And the more I think about it, the more I realize something. I think I have spent a large part of my life trying to stay loyal to older versions of myself. To Jessica, who at 18 years old swore she was going to save the world. To Jessica, who was convinced that if she worked hard enough, if she loved enough, and if she sacrificed enough, everything would turn out okay. To Jessica, who thought that by 30 she would have a husband, children, and a house with a big kitchen where she would welcome her whole family every Sunday. To Jessica, who believed that love was enough. To Jessica, who confused sacrifice with self-love. To Jessica, who thought healing was a straight line. To Jessica, who didn't know she would spend nights crying in parking lots. To Jessica, who still didn't know the word goodbye. And sometimes I wonder if she would be proud of me, or if she would look at me and say, "When did you change so much?" Because the truth is that I've changed. Actually, I've changed a lot. I no longer love the same things. I no longer dream about the same life. I no longer stay in places where I have to convince someone to see me. I no longer believe that my worth depends on how much I can endure. And honestly, there are days when I don't even recognize myself. But I think that's what no one tells us about growing up. That there will be moments when you feel like a stranger in your own life. That one day you will wake up and realize that the person you are today will never have been recognized by the person you were 10 years ago. And that's scary. Because there is something deeply painful about accepting that some versions of ourselves had an expiration date. There are people who have been dead inside of us for years, but we keep carrying them as if they were still alive. We keep making decisions to make them proud. We keep saying yes to things we no longer want. We keep living lives they chose. We keep chasing dreams that no longer belong to us. We keep trying to fit into places that outgrew us a long time ago. And while we do all of that, we lose ourselves, little by little, in silence, until one day, without realizing it, we are sitting in front of the mirror asking ourselves, "Who are you?" And perhaps that is one of the most terrifying questions a human being can ask, because it means accepting that the answer is no longer the same, and that is exhausting. It is exhausting to carry expectations that were born 15 years ago. It is exhausting to keep trying to save relationships, jobs, and versions of ourselves that have already ended. It is exhausting to pretend that we still want a life that stopped making us happy a long time ago. But here's the truth it took me almost 30 years to understand. Growing up is not becoming the person you said you would be. Growing up is realizing that you are allowed to change your mind. You are allowed to wake up one day and say, "Thank you for everything, but this life is no longer fitting me." You are allowed to start all over. You are allowed to disappoint the version of yourself that made plans without knowing everything you were going to survive. Because that version of you never had to carry the goodbyes that you have carried. She never had to learn how to live with a broken heart. She never had to reinvent herself after losing people, dreams, or parts of herself. She did the best she could with the information she had. And you are doing exactly the same thing. So today I want us to do something together. I want to allow yourself to let your guard down for the next few minutes. And I want you to stop pretending that you have all the answers. I want you to ask yourself with all the honesty you can, if no one expected anything from me, who would I choose to be? Because maybe the question was never who you are. Maybe the question has always been, who would you be if you stopped trying to be who you promised you would become? And that's what we're going to talk about today, about the weight of being the same person. So you know what to do. Get comfortable, grab your coffee, your cafecito, your glass of wine, or a cold beer, and get ready to chismear with me. When you are the daughter of immigrants, you learn something very quickly. You don't have the luxury of making mistakes. And I know some people will hear that and think everyone makes mistakes. But if you grew up in an immigrant family, you know exactly what I'm talking about. Because your parents didn't just give you life, your parents left the life. They left their siblings, their friends, their traditions, the food they knew, the streets they could walk with their eyes closed. They left birthdays, funerals, Christmas with family. They left an entire country hoping that you would have the opportunities they never had. And there is something very heavy about growing up knowing that, because no one tells you directly, but you learn it. You learn it when you hear your parents say, all of this is so that you can have a better future. You learn it when you see them come home tired from work, when you see your father's hands after years of working, when you hear your mother say that she doesn't need anything for herself. You learn it when you understand that your parents' dream, little by little, begins to become your responsibility. And then you grow up believing that you have to take advantage of every opportunity, that you have to work harder, that you have to be successful, that you have to make all of the sacrifice worth it, that you cannot fail, that you cannot stop, that you cannot say, I'm tired. Because how dare you be tired when someone before you was willing to leave everything behind? And without realizing it, you begin to live with a pressure that you don't even know how to name. And many of you already know, because I shared it in previous episodes, that I grew up working with my dad. And I remember being out in the sun, tired, doing landscaping, and thinking that this was simply what families did. They help each other. And although I didn't understand it at the time, I think that's where I learned one of the lessons that has been the hardest for me to unlearn. That my worth was found in how much I could endure. That the harder I worked, the more I was worth. That the more I sacrificed, the more deserving I was of love. That rest was something you earned. That asking for help was a weakness. That being strong meant continuing to move forward even when you were breaking on the inside. And that is one of the most dangerous lies I have ever had to unlearn. Because no one prepares you for that day your body begins to collect on everything you have survived. No one prepares you for the moment you realize you have spent years functioning in survival mode. No one prepares you to discover that you are very good at taking care of everyone except yourself. And it took me years to understand something that today I want to remind that person listening to this. Being tired is not a medal. You do not receive an award for destroying yourself trying to prove that you are enough. You do not have to earn the right to rest. And I wish I had understood that much sooner, because the Jessica who was 15 years old would be proud of many things. I think she would be proud to know that we're still here, that we have a master's degree, that we speak in front of hundreds of people, that we created a podcast, that we help survivors, that we still believe in people even after everything. But I also think she would be surprised, because she never imagined that one day she would have depression. She never imagined the nights we would spend crying, wondering if we were too much for some people and not enough for others. She never imagined that our hearts would be broken, that we would lose friendships we thought would last a lifetime, that there would be goodbyes we would never be prepared for, that there would be days when we would pull into the parking lot of our home and sit in the car for 20 minutes trying to gather enough strength to walk inside and pretend that everything was okay. She never imagined that we would have to start over so many times, because that's the other thing no one tells you about growing up, that starting over is not something that happens only once. It happens over and over and over again. You start over after a breakup. You start over after leaving a job. You start over when you lose someone. You start over when you realize that the life you built no longer looks like the life you want. And perhaps that is the hardest part for me to accept, that life is not a straight line, that you don't arrive at a point where you finally say, okay, that's it. I understand everything now. Because even at 29 years old, there are still days when I feel like a little girl trying to figure out how to be an adult. There are still days when I miss versions of myself that no longer exist. There are still days when I wonder if the younger Jessica would be proud of the woman I became. And I like to think she would, not because everything turned out the way she imagined, but because despite everything, we're still here. And sometimes surviving also deserves to be celebrated. And there is a kind of grief that no one talks about. And no, I'm not referring to the grief of losing someone. I'm not referring to the grief that comes after a goodbye, a funeral, or a breakup. I'm referring to the grief of leaving behind a life that was actually working. Because I think we've been taught that we only have permission to leave when something is wrong, when there is abuse, when there is toxicity, when there is pain. But what happens when you have to leave a place you love? What happens when the life you're leaving behind is a good life? What happens when the people you're leaving behind are good people? Because leaving something that hurts you is difficult, but leaving someone you love, that breaks you in a completely different way. And I think this is one of the most honest conversations I'm going to have with you. Not long ago, I made one of the hardest decisions of my life. I decided to leave the agency where I worked for 6 years. And it is still hard for me to say it without feeling something in my chest, because it was 6 years of my life, 6 years of late night phone calls, 6 years of survivors allowing me to enter some of the most vulnerable moments of their lives, 6 years of sitting across from someone who had lost all hope and saying, "You are not alone." 6 years of building something that honestly became part of me, because that's what happens when you spend a large part of your 20s in one place. You stop saying, "I'm going to go to work," and you start saying, "I'm going to my second home." And yes, there were difficult days. Actually, there were many. There were days when I would come home and wonder how much longer I could carry the weight of hearing so much pain. There were days when I locked myself in my office to cry for 5 minutes before walking into another meeting. There were days when I felt like I wasn't enough. There were days when I brought work home with me, even though I had already physically left the building. Because when you do this work, you learn something very quickly. You cannot turn your heart off at 5 o'clock in the afternoon. And even so, I stayed because I loved what I did. I loved my team. I loved sitting at tables with community leaders and thinking, look how far we've come. I love watching the people on my team grow. I love receiving messages from survivors years later saying, "Thank you for not giving up on me." And there is something I need to say because I know someone listening to this needs to hear it too. It is okay to love a season of your life and still let it go. I'm going to repeat that. It's okay to love a season of your life and still let it go. Because I think for a long time, I believed that if I left, it meant I hadn't been grateful. That if I left, I was abandoning something. That if I left, I was disappointing the people who had believed in me. But the reality was something else. The reality was that I was growing. And growing, even though no one tells us, also means saying goodbye to versions of ourselves that did exactly what we needed them to do. And I remember sitting alone and asking myself, what happens if I leave? And then came the question that truly terrified me. Who am I if I leave? Because my job wasn't just my job. It was my identity. It was the automatic answer whenever someone asked me, "So what do you do?" It was the title beneath my name. It was the reason many people knew me. It was the version of myself that I had spent years building. So who was I without that title? Who was I without being a director? Who was I without the meetings, the events, the conferences, and the phone calls? Who was I if I left the place where I had spent a large part of my 20s? And I think that's when I realized something. There is a difference between doing something and becoming it. Because I didn't just work at this agency, I had become the agency. And that is dangerous. Because when your identity is completely tied up to one thing, the day that that changes, you feel like you disappear too. And I remember my last day. I remember packing my things. I remember looking at my office. I remember closing the door and thinking, is that it? Because how strange is it to discover that the world doesn't stop when yours does? People keep sending emails, cars keep driving by, the sun keeps rising, and there you are holding a box with years of your life inside it. And I don't think I cried because I was leaving a job. I think I cried because I was saying goodbye to a version of myself. The Jessica who arrived afraid. The Jessica who learned how to lead. The Jessica who found her voice. The Jessica who spent a large part of her 20s trying to help the world. And honestly, I think part of me believed that if I left, I was losing all of that. But I was wrong. Because the versions of ourselves that helped us get there do not disappear. They stay with us. They simply stop leading the way. And perhaps that is what growing up is. Understanding that you can close a chapter without invalidating the story. That you can be deeply grateful and at the same time know that it's time to leave. That you can love a place and recognize that you are no longer the person who arrived there 6 years ago. And I think that is the question many of us avoid because it's terrifying to answer. Who are you when you remove all the titles from your name? Not the director, not the social worker, not the daughter, not the friend, not the partner, not the strong one, just you. Who are you when no one needs anything from you? Who are you when you stop producing? Who are you when the applause ends? because it took me a long time to understand that I was still Jessica, even without the title. And perhaps you need to hear that today too. You are still you, even if you changed careers, even if you left the relationship, even if you lost something you loved, even if you're starting over, because a person's worth has never been found in what they do. It is found in who they are when no one is watching. And maybe growing up is exactly that. Having the courage to introduce yourself to the world one more time and say, "Nice to meet you. I don't know exactly who I am yet, but I'm learning how to get to know myself again." And there's also people who come into your life and do something you thought was impossible. They make you believe again, believe in love again, believe in right timing again, believe that maybe after everything you've been through, there are still good things waiting for you. And that is the dangerous thing about hope. Because hope is beautiful, but it's also incredibly fragile. There are people who come into your life at exactly the right moment, when you least expect them, when you had already made peace with the idea of being alone, when you had decided to focus on your career, your goals, on healing. And little by little, you begin to let your guard down. You begin to share parts of yourself that you had spent years protecting. You begin to think, maybe this time will be different. Maybe this time it'll work. And when they leave without an explanation, without saying goodbye, without a difficult conversation, without an "I'm sorry," leaving you talking to yourself. And I think one of the most painful things that has ever happened to me was not that someone left. It was realizing that they could leave so easily. Because there's a big difference between losing someone and realizing that for that person, losing you was never a risk. And that hurts. And it hurts more than many people are willing to admit. Because we don't only grieve people, we grieve the life we imagine with them. We grieve the conversations that never happened. We grieve the memories that never got the chance to exist. We grieve the version of ourselves that appeared when we were with that person. Because there are people who make us feel seen, so understood, that for a moment we think, oh, so this is what it was. And when they leave, they don't just take part of themselves with them. They also take a part of the story we had started writing in our heads. And if I'm being completely honest, I think that's what broke me the most. I wasn't crying over a man. I was crying over the possibility, the plans, the phone calls, the things that were left unfinished, the good morning that never came, the conversations I imagined we would have 5 years from now, the what if this time it works? Because I think we all have that what if this time it works that has broken our hearts. And what a strange thing grief is. Because you can be 29 years old with a master's degree, a career, a job you love, people who love you, and still find yourself crying in the parking lot of a grocery store because someone decided to leave your life. Life has a very particular way of reminding us that no matter how much healing we've done, we are still human. And perhaps that the hardest part wasn't accepting that they were gone. It was accepting that I was never going to get the explanation I believed I deserved. Because I think we grew up believing that all stories have an ending, that someone always comes back, that there is always a conversation, that closure always arrives. But life doesn't work that way. Sometimes people become a lesson before they become a memory. Sometimes the closure you're looking for is accepting that the other person has already made a decision, even if they have never had the courage to tell you, even if part of you is still waiting for an explanation, even if there are still days when you wonder what happened. And I know someone needs to hear this today. The lack of closure is also an answer. Silence also communicates. Absence also makes a decision. And although it took me a long time to understand it, today I know this. Someone leaving does not mean that you were not enough. It does not mean that you were too much. And it does not mean that you did something wrong. Sometimes it simply means that that person went as far as they could go with you. And that does not make what you felt any less real. It does not make the plans any less valid, and it does not make the goodbyes any less painful. It simply means that the story ended before you were ready to close the book. But here's the beautiful part. Even if it doesn't feel that way right now, you survived. You survived the messages that never came, the nights when you checked your phone, the times you wondered if they would come back. You survived the version of yourself that was convinced she would never feel okay again. And if you survived that, you're going to survive anything. Because perhaps the lesson was never learning how to stop loving. Perhaps the lesson was learning that even when someone leaves, you still have yourself. And that even though we sometimes forget it, is also a way of coming home. But I think guilt is often the price we pay for growing. Because every time you change, someone becomes uncomfortable. And sometimes that person is you. Because there is something deeply uncomfortable without looking back and realizing that you are no longer who you used to be. You no longer respond to messages the same way. You no longer have the same patience. You are no longer willing to sacrifice yourself until you are completely empty. You no longer say yes when you want to say no. And although that sounds like growth, it also comes with something we don't talk about enough: guilt. The guilt of setting boundaries with people you love. The guilt of leaving relationships you thought would last forever. The guilt of saying, I can't help you this time. The guilt of choosing yourself. Because if you're anything like me, you probably grew up believing that being a good person meant being available to everyone. That love meant enduring. That being strong meant carrying more than you could hold. That setting boundaries was selfish. And let me tell you something that took me almost 30 years to understand. The people who benefit from your lack of boundaries will almost always be the first to become upset when you finally set them. And that hurts because you want to believe that people will love every version of you. But the reality is that some people only know the version of you who always said yes, the version who solved problems, the version who came to the rescue, the version who was willing to break herself so that someone else wouldn't have to. There was a time in my life when I thought my purpose was to fix people. And how exhausting it is to live believing that you are responsible for healing wounds you did not cause. How exhausting is it to sit across from someone and think, if I just love them a little bit more, if I just have a little bit more patience, if I sacrifice a little more, if I stay a little longer. Because the truth is that some of the people I have loved the most in my life were at war with themselves. And I learned in the hardest way possible that no matter how much you love someone, you cannot do the work that belongs to them. You cannot heal for them. You cannot grow for them. You cannot love them enough for them to finally learn how to love themselves. And that was a lesson that broke my heart because I wanted to believe that I could save everyone. Maybe because I dedicated a large part of my life helping people. Maybe because it's easier to focus on other people's wounds than to look at your own. Maybe because somewhere inside me, that little girl still existed, the one who thought that she had to earn love by being useful. But there comes a moment when you realize that you're tired of being the strong one, tired of being the one who always understands, tired of being the one who always stays. And then you do something that is incredibly scary. You begin to choose yourself. You begin to say no. You begin to leave places where you are no longer happy. You begin to set boundaries. And for a while, guilt sits beside you and whispers in your ear, you're changing. You're not the same anymore. You didn't used to be like this. And you know what? It's right. I'm not the same anymore because the woman I am today finally understood something that the younger Jessica needed to hear. I did not come into this world to save anyone. I came into this world to live my own life. And there is a big difference between the two because growing up doesn't always look like winning. Sometimes growing up looks like disappointing people who were used to a version of you that no longer exists. And that's okay because some people will know all of your versions, and others will only know the one who lost access to you, and both are part of growing up. I am 29 years old, and every time I say that, I feel something strange, because my entire life, I thought 29 would feel different. I thought that there would be a moment when I would wake up one morning and say, oh, here it is. This is what being an adult feels like. I thought that by this age, I would have all the answers, that I will no longer question myself so much, that I would have perfectly organized plan for the next 10 years, that love would make sense, that I would know exactly who I am. And if you had asked me 10 years ago what life would look like at this age, I would have given you a completely different answer. I would have said that I would have probably been married already, that I would have children, that I would live in a house I would have decorated for Christmas since November, that I would have a quiet and predictable life. I never would have said, I'm going to have a podcast where thousands of people will listen to my most vulnerable thoughts. I never would have said, I'm going to go dedicate my life working with survivors and fighting against human trafficking. I never would have imagined that one day I would get on a plane by myself for work travel and feel proud of the life I've built. I never would have imagined that I would be giving trainings, that I would stand in front of rooms full of people, that my voice would reach places that the younger Jessica didn't even know existed. And I definitely never would have imagined that one day I would be in Las Vegas giving an entire presentation in Spanish in front of hundreds of people, talking about one of the things I am most passionate about. And I can still see myself there a few minutes before it started, taking a deep breath, looking at myself in the mirror, thinking, how did we get here? Because there are moments in life that are so surreal that your mind takes time to catch up to them. And that was one of them. The daughter of Mexican immigrants, the little girl who did landscaping with her dad, the little girl who grew up feeling too sensitive for the world, standing in front of people speaking in Spanish, doing something she loves. If that isn't proof that life can surprise you, I don't know what is. And yet, there are days when I still feel like a little girl pretending to be an adult. There are days when I sit on my couch staring at the ceiling and wonder if all adults are pretending to know what they're doing. Because I think one of the greatest disappointments of growing up is discovering that no one really has all the answers. We're all improvising. We're all trying to figure out how to do this. We're all bringing younger versions of ourselves to places they never imagined they would see. And I think that's where the beauty of all of this lies. Because a 15-year-old Jessica never would have believed that we would make it. She was too busy trying to fit in, too busy worrying about what other people thought, too busy trying to survive. And look at us now. We're not perfect. We're still healing. We're still learning. We're still starting over more times than we like to admit. But here we are. And that has to mean something. So I want you to do something. And yes, I know this might feel a little uncomfortable, but stay with me. If you're driving, wait until you arrive. But if you can, close your eyes for a moment and take a deep breath. Inhale. Exhale. And complete this sentence. Nice to meet you. The person I am today is not the person you were 5 years ago, not the person others expect you to be, not the person who appears on your social media, the person you are today. Who is she? Who is he? Is she stronger than she imagined? Is she tired? Is she healing? Is she learning how to set boundaries? Is she starting over? Is she trying to find herself after losing herself for a long time? Do you recognize her? Because that's an important question. Have you really met her? Have you spent time with her? Have you asked her what she needs? Or are you still trying to become someone you left behind years ago? Because maybe that's where the problem is. Maybe we're still comparing ourselves to versions of us who never had to live through what we have lived through now. The version of you from 10 years ago doesn't know the goodbyes you've survived. She doesn't know the times your heart was broken. She doesn't know the nights you cried thinking you couldn't do this anymore. She doesn't know the strength you found when you had no other choice. So of course you're not the same person. You were never supposed to be. And maybe that's what I've been trying to say throughout this entire episode. You do not owe permanence to anyone, not even to the younger version of yourself. Because growing up is not becoming who you promised you would be. Growing up is having the courage to look at the person you are today and say, nice to meet you. I know it took us a while to get here, and I know there were days when we thought we were gonna make it, but I'm glad I'm finally get to meet you. And honestly, after everything we've lived through, I think the woman I'm becoming has been worth every goodbye, every fresh start, and every version of myself I had to leave behind to get here. And as always, I want to recommend you guys a book, and the book is called The Defining Decade by Meg J. And I think this book connects so much with today's conversation because we often think that reaching a certain age means we should already have all the answers, that we should know exactly who we are. We should have the perfect career, the perfect relationship, the perfect life. But this book reminds us that our 20s and our early years of adulthood are not about having everything figured out. They're about making decisions, learning, making mistakes, and slowly building the person we are becoming. And I think that connects deeply with something we talked about today. The person you are today does not have to look like the person you imagined 10 years ago. Your dreams can change. Your path can change. You can change. And that doesn't mean you failed. It means you are growing. Because perhaps one of the hardest things to accept is that the life we built will not always be the life we imagined. But that doesn't mean it is the wrong life. Sometimes the most beautiful life is the one we never would have had the courage to imagine. So I highly recommend it. So before we end this episode, I want to read a letter I wrote to myself. Dear Jessica, we did it. Not the way you imagined, not following the path you wrote in your head when you were younger, not with every piece perfectly placed exactly where you thought it would be, but we did it. And I want you to stop for a moment and recognize that, because I know how many times you thought you wouldn't make it. I know how many nights you cried quietly, wondering if life would ever feel lighter. I know how many times you looked at your life and thought, was this how it was supposed to be? I know how many times you had to pick up pieces of yourself that you thought you would never find again. We survived the days we thought would destroy us, the goodbyes we never wanted to have, the people who promised they would stay and didn't, the versions of ourselves we had to let go of, the moments when we questioned our own worth, The days when simply getting out of bed was already a victory. And yet, here we are. We are still here. We are still dreaming. We are still trying. We are still believing in people, even though some people have disappointed us. We are still believing in love, even though some stories did not end the way we wanted them to. We are still finding reasons to stay, even in moments when leaving seemed easier. And I want you to know something. I am so proud of you. Not only because of the accomplishments that the other people can see, not only because of the titles, the presentations, the podcasts, the workshops, or the goals you have achieved. I am proud of you because of the battles nobody saw, because of the tears you wiped away alone, because of the times you chose to keep going even when you were afraid, because you learned how to set boundaries, because you learned that your worth does not depend on how much you can carry, because you understood that you do not have to save everyone to deserve love. And even though there are still difficult days, even though there are still days when we ask ourselves what we are doing, even though there are still parts of us that are healing, I like the woman we are becoming. I like the woman who learned that changing does not mean failing. I like the woman who understood that starting over does not erase everything she has built. I like the woman who finally is learning how to choose herself. So keep going. Don't ever give up. With so much love, Jessica Lomelin. And to all of you who have been listening to this series, thank you. Thank you for joining me through every uncomfortable conversation. Thank you for allowing me to share parts of my story that are not always easy to tell. Thank you for celebrating this first anniversary of No Me Callo, I Won't Stay Quiet with me. When I started this podcast, I never imagined what it would become. I never imagined the conversations we would have, the messages I would receive, the people who would tell me, I feel like you're talking about my life. Because that has always been the most beautiful part of this space. Reminding ourselves that even though our stories are different, many times we feel the same things. And to celebrate this first year together, I want to do something special. Like I promised, we have a giveaway to thank you for being part of this community. Because this podcast exists because of you. Thank you to everyone who listens every Friday, to those who share episodes, to those who send me messages, to those who are arriving for the first time and finding a place where they feel supported and less alone. The gift is a simply way of saying thank you for being here. Thank you for believing in this project. Thank you for allowing me to be a small part of your lives. So to enter this giveaway, all you have to do is send me a message on any platform or social media and tell me what episode, what quote, or what book made you feel less alone this year. I will choose the winner on August 10th, so you still have time to participate. And I want to close this series by reminding you of something. I think all of us are walking through life trying to figure out what we're doing. We're all improvising, we're all learning, and we're all carrying wounds that no one else can see. And maybe that's okay. Maybe we're not meant to have all the answers. Maybe growing up does not mean finally having life figured out. Maybe growing up means learning how to walk with the questions, learning how to trust ourselves, learning how to let go of a version of ourselves that already served its purpose. Because perhaps the greatest act of self-love is not finding yourself. Because sometimes we spend years searching for ourselves as if we are someone who is lost. And maybe we've never been lost. Maybe we're simply changing. And maybe the greatest act of self-love is giving yourself permission to introduce yourself again, to look at your life and say, nice to meet you. This is me. I am not the same person I used to be. I have changed. I have lived. I have lost. I have gained. I have healed. And I am still learning. And that is enough. In the description of this episode, you will find the Amazon link with the complete list of books mentioned in No Me Callo, I Won't Stay Quiet from the very first episode all the way to today's. And don't forget that every Friday there is a new episode waiting for you. Next Friday, we begin our new August series called The Conversations Nobody Wants to Have. Because we're going to talk about the things that make us uncomfortable. Those conversations we often avoid because they are too complex, too personal, or too difficult to admit. And I want to begin with a question. Can we acknowledge the harm someone caused without denying that they were also a good person? Because the first episode of this new series is called Good People Can Still Hurt You. And during that conversation, we're going to talk about parents who love their children and still left them with wounds, people with good intentions who caused pain, professionals and leaders with blind spots, and the uncomfortable reality that the world is not divided between good people and bad people. It is divided between human beings. And honestly, I think this may be one of the most uncomfortable series I have ever created, but it might also be one of the most important. So if you ever have wondered how someone could love you and hurt you at the same time, if you have ever struggled with accepting that people who impacted your life the most were much more complex than you wanted to admit, then don't miss it. You were listening to No Me Callo, I Won't Stay Quiet. I'm your host, Jessica Lomelin. Until next time.